this is a video that Jordan Peterson just put out. Was Karl Marx a Satanist? Where he's interviewing that scholar of Marxism who I debunked before.
Know why he turned to atheism. These poems that he wrote that were pans to
let's get this first thing out of the way. Just before we even get going, right? Karl Marx was an atheist, no question about it. But was Karl Marx a Satanist? Well, not in the literal sense, because the Church of Satan believes in free market capitalism. Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, the founder of the religion that calls itself Satanism, believes in the writings of Ayn Rand. That is a fact. You Google the Church of Satan, you go read the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey, they love free market capitalism. And that is one thing that evangelical Christian anti-communists always overlook. The open actual Satanists read the same books they read, right? I'm just telling you. Atlas Shrugged, she was an atheist. Ayn Rand was an atheist, and she was against religion because religion said that right and wrong exist. It called for people to be compassionate and kind to each other. And actual Satanists, like literal we love Satan people, they all promote Ayn Rand libertarian objectivism. So right there, the premise of the video, let's just acknowledge what's there. Actual open Satanists read the exact same economic literature that anti-communist evangelicals read. Atlas Shrugged, Ludwig von Mises, Milton Friedman, actual Satanists love capitalism and love the free market. And the Church of Satan is a pro-free market libertarian institution. That is a fact. So let's just get that out of the way, but let's continue.
Please. Is that after he becomes an atheist?
No, he's writing, so the first one was 1837, wrote another in 1841. He wrote a bunch of them.
Right.
He did just a chilling play called Ulanem.
Yes.
Oulanem. And people that are watching this, if they now type into their computer Ulanem, even in Google, it'll pop up. Play by Karl Marx.
Yeah.
It even has a Wikipedia entry.
Well, I looked at the Wikipedia page, actually, and you can pull up the Wikipedia page. Karl Marx only ever wrote the first act of the play. And he wrote the first act of a play when he was like a teenager. So, I mean, I pulled it up, actually. And, I mean, he never finished writing it, and it's just a play he started writing about someone wondering if they should destroy the world or something like that. So I Googled it, and I mean, he never finished the play. There you go.
And let me warn people, you might not want to do this, but if you click the images button, you will see, there's some satanic stuff up there from like, not heavy metal, but like black metal groups. So Ulanem is an anagram for Emmanuel.
Yeah, but what does that have to do with Karl Marx? Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure black metal wasn't around in the time that Karl Marx was around. Other people use the anagram, the same anagram he uses hundreds of years later for their rock and roll album because it's an anti-religious anagram. Like this is already very silly. And again, we could just make fun of this, but honestly, we should point out that he's kind of pointing to something true, but he's doing it in a way that is kind of pandering to people's ignorance. And he's pointing to something true in order to reinforce people's delusions and ignorance about these things. So let's let him continue. But like that, this is just a non sequitur. We all know Karl Marx was very anti-religious. And apparently this play that he wrote when he was a teenager, the name of it has been used by satanic rock bands in the 80s. Like, oh boy.
Or Manuelo.
Right.
So Marx takes Emmanuel, which is the name given to Christ, or Manuelo, and he flips it into this anagram called Ulanem. And it's this chilling play. The main character is Lucindo,
yeah.
Lucindo. And you just can't believe what you're reading with this play. So that was written later in the 1840s. So really, the prime of his writing, including the decade when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, is also the same decade when he was writing these poems
and plays.
And throughout his life, his kids and others would say, he had a favorite line always from Mephistophelian. Everything that exists deserves to perish. So that
yes, everything that's history is constantly marching forward. That's what he was saying. All that is solid melts into air. Right? I mean, that's dialectics. That's Hegel. Right? All that exists contains the seeds of its own destruction. That's a key part of the Marxist philosophy. And it's also true. All things that exist will eventually pass away. The only things that are eternal, in my view, are spiritual, right? All material will eventually fade away and decay. Now, Marx believed that all that existed was material. He did not recognize any spiritual forces. But yeah, I mean, the idea that all that is material, all that is solid melts into air, and that's not a scandalous thing at all. I mean, that's pretty widely acknowledged. The material world that is around us will eventually go away. The earth will eventually not exist anymore. You will eventually die unless humanity overcomes immortality. Trees, there's a cycle of life. I mean, that's the dialectical philosophy, right? And the poet Goethe expressed it in the piece, Faust. And again, that's not scandalous at all, right? But again, you're supposed to be scared. So, and I don't even really want to defend Karl Marx on all of this, because Karl Marx was very anti-religious, and he's pointing to something true here, but he's doing it in a very juvenile way. He's just trying to scare conservatives who don't know anything about this, and he's trying to then equate it with woke leftism. And both of those things are dishonest.
The part of him throughout his life. His son, Edgar, has a letter where he addresses his father as "my dear devil," which I don't know. Maybe it's playful. I don't know.
Yeah.
Although I would never, call my dad "my dear devil." His wife called him "my wicked knave." I quote.
That sounds flirty to me. I'm just saying, right? My naughty boy, my wicked knave. I mean, this is silly.
Henrik Heinzen referring to him as a goblin who tried to take me under his spell.
Little known fact: the opening line of the Communist Manifesto is a specter is haunting Europe. But true story. You can Google this. This is actually true. True story. The actual first translation of the Communist Manifesto. The actual first translation was "a frightful hobgoblin is haunting Europe." That was the first translation. A frightful hobgoblin. A frightful hobgoblin. So there you go. So let's continue.
Cases of where he's using that kind of language. When Engels first met him, he describes him as this dark man from Trier.
Well, Karl Marx was literally a dark man. You do know that. He had very, very dark skin. His nickname was the Moor, right? He was a Sephardic Jew, and he looked like he was from North Africa. He had very dark skin. So when Engels called him a dark man, he was referring to the fact that Karl Marx's complexion was very dark.
Who hops and leaps and springs on his heels. The
doesn't sound like the devil. It sounds like an Easter bunny to me, right? He hops and springs on his heels. So he's a dark-skinned fellow who hops around. He's the Easter bunny. I mean, this is
monster of 10,000 devils. He describes him, and the letter from his father is. Which was written in 1837, a year before his father died. So his father writes to him, March 2nd, 1837. Karl, at times my heart delights in thinking of you and your fortune, and yet at times I cannot rid myself of ideas which arouse in me sad forebodings and fear when I am struck as if by lightning by the thought, is your heart in accord with your head, your talents? Has a room for the earthly but gentler sediments which in this vale of sorrow, it's a beautiful letter in many ways, are essentially consoling for a man of feeling? And then this question from the father of Karl Marx to his at this point, 18-year-old son. And since that heart, Karl, is obviously animated and governed by a demon, not granted to all men.
Yeah, I mean, wow. I've never had a demon inside of me. I've never had, mental health struggles. I've never had depression. I mean, this is, oh my God. I mean, there you go. I mean, no one watching this has ever wrestled with demons in their lives or had their parent say to them, I'm worried about the demons that you are wrestling with. I mean, this is so silly, right? And the thing is, I actually kind of want to defend Paul here because he's actually pointing to something true, but he's doing it in such a stupid way to appeal to stupid ideas that people already have. Like, he could actually teach his audience something good here, but instead he's pandering to stupidity, right? And I don't want to just completely rip Paul a new one here around this one because, he's anyway.
Is that demon heavenly or Faustian? Will you ever, and that is not the least painful doubt of my heart, will you ever be capable of truly human domestic happiness? Will
you ever be capable of happiness? Yes, right? He sees his son struggling with demons inside, emotional, yeah. I mean, this is,
and this doubt has no less tortured me since I have come to love a certain person like my own child.
Yes, his father loves him and says, you're very depressed. I see you wrestling with demons. You got him. I mean, you got him.
Will you ever be capable of imparting happiness to those immediately around you? By the way, the answer was no, right?
Well,
but that
obviously
phrase,
the father had intimations of that.
Yeah, and since that heart is obviously animated and governed by a demon not granted to all men, is that demon heavenly or Faustian?
Right,
that's his dad.
Yeah. You got him. You got him, right? I mean, his dad wrote him a letter and said, I'm sorry you're struggling with depression, son. I care about you. You got him. You got him. I mean, he's literally Satan incarnated. I mean, he's a walking devil horn. Karl Marx probably had a tail, right, folks? He probably had horns and a tail. This is so stupid.
And there's only so many.
This is insulting to religious people, right? I am a religious person. I am deeply offended by this, right? I mean, this is why people think religious people are stupid, right? This is why they think religious people are stupid, right? I mean, this is literally like, oh my God. Marx probably breathed fire. This is so stupid.
Any of those things, I think that a sympathetic Marxist or Marxist biographer can shrug off. I mean, there's just so many statements like that from him and people about him and people who knew him and loved ones and a wife, a son, a best friend from Engels, and then the different writings. Whew.
Okay, so let's attack this.
His wife called him a naughty knave, a devilish knave. His dad wrote him a letter one time. He was a dark man because he had a dark complexion. He hopped around like the Easter Bunny. Oh, dear God.
Now, was he a Satanist, right?
Well,
actually, if he was a Satanist, he would believe in free market capitalism because that's what Anton LaVey believes in. All the actual Satanists believe in free market capitalism, as I said at the beginning of the video. So was he a Satanist? No, he was not, because the Church of Satan believes in free markets.
Well, that is a whole different thing that I can't.
Well, it's also the title of the video. It's a whole different thing. I mean, it's actually the title of the video. So,
personally answer.
Well, it seems not unreasonable to presuppose that he was a devotee of the Mephistophelian ethos.
Yeah, I think that's
right.
Well, what does that mean? Let's define ethos. Let's get the actual definition of ethos. Ethos, a characteristic spirit of a culture, era, or community. That's purely in the eye of the beholder, right? So if you don't like him, you could say he was part of a satanic spirit of a culture, era, or community. I mean, that's purely a subjective thing. That's not That's just in the eye of the beholder.
So
Really
the
good way to
question
put it.
is, what constitutes a Satanist? Well, someone who generates a murderous doctrine, that raises questions. I mean,
So what about the British Empire? Is that satanic? Right? The British Empire that killed millions of people, man-made famines in India, opium wars that destroyed China's economy and stopped them from developing and killed hundreds of millions of people, the famines in Ireland. I mean, the British Empire that ruled in the name of the Protestant Church of England. They created a murderous mass movement that murdered people in Asia, in the Caribbean, in Africa. I mean, nobody's killed more people than the British Empire, right? The British Empire that believed in free trade, the British Empire that believed in survival of the fittest and Darwinism, the British Empire that promoted Malthusianism and the idea of overpopulation, the British Empire that murdered millions of people all across the planet in order to enrich the bankers of London. There you go.
dead serious about that.
Right.
The most murderous doctrine ever promoted in the roughly Judeo-Christian context by a large margin. So I would say it's incumbent on those who would defend him to describe why we wouldn't just assume that. But the part of the reason that I was so interested in talking to you was because I felt that what you documented in your book was extraordinarily telling from the psychological perspective, because I know how these things work. And it is not something that can be overlooked, that was his favorite quote.
Right.
I mean,
Yes, it is not to be overlooked that he thought all that existed was in the process of decaying, that the world was constantly changing, and that all that existed contains its seeds of destruction. There's a reason he loves that Goethe quote, and that's because it fits his philosophy perfectly. And if you knew anything about his philosophy, you would know that.
especially not when you understand Goethe's centrality in the German intellectual tradition.
Yes, actually, if you understand it, it makes perfect sense. Goethe is one of the most beloved German poets, and he wrote a play. And in that play, the character of the devil that is tempting Faust, Dr. Faust, says a quote that matches Karl Marx's philosophy. And Karl Marx was very anti-religious. Karl Marx considered himself to be a rebel. He considered the church to be an oppressive institution. So he attached to the quote. I'm waiting for anything of substance here.
It's like having a favorite quote from Shakespeare, right? And it's not any old quote. It's
it's a quote that matches his philosophy. Karl Marx was an atheist, and Karl Marx also believed that history was constantly marching forward and that all that exists is constantly in a state of decay, that all that is solid melts into air. I mean, there's nothing here.
Central credo of Mephistopheles. So that's extraordinarily telling. Now, I do have another.
Can I give you a...
Yes.
So Robert Payne, the very serious academic, no right-winger, British man of letters, the guy who really broke this first in his 1968 biography of Marx, all right? His chapter where he talks about this stuff is called The Demons. And
let's look up Robert Payne, right? Let's look him up. Robert Payne, who wrote a 1968 biography of Karl Marx, right? Biography of Marx. Let's look him up. Robert Payne, right? 1968 biography of Marx. And who was Robert Payne? Who was he? So this is our source, right? Robert Payne, an English-born biographer. He also wrote novels, poetries, and magazines. Prolific and best known for his biographies of prominent people, including Leonardo da Vinci, Hitler, Stalin, Karl Marx, Lenin, Mao, Mahatma Gandhi, and all of which were selected by the Book of the Month Club. Okay, there we go, right? He's just a mainstream British writer, right? He was criticized because his biography of Hitler was seen as attempting to humanize Hitler. Interesting. Right. And he focused on Hitler's personal life. And before he became absorbed in politics, he was admired for his narrative and imaginative power. Payne was said to be a firm adherent of the conspiracy theory of politics. And among biographies of Lenin, Payne's book was described as the easiest to read and also the easiest to forget. you know, okay. I mean, this guy just sounds like a pretty mainstream British author.
His Marx biography. Now, he wrote this, and I'm not saying that I endorse this. As an academic, I can't say if this is correct.
Yeah, you probably shouldn't, because there's been all kinds of people that have written about his life, and this is like the most mainstream milquetoast biography ever written. But I mean, there we go. I bet. What did he did he say something good about devils? Did he disrespect the Bible or something? I mean, this is
There were times when Marx seemed to be possessed by demons. That's what Payne wrote. And
that doesn't seem literary at all, right? I'm sure that literally means anyway.
Now, this I would at least more endorse. Marx had the devil's view of the world and the devil's malignity. Sometimes he seemed to know that he was accomplishing works of evil. I think that gets closer to it. Now,
what were those works of evil? Would you mind sharing with us what those works of evil were?
Pastor Richard Wurmbrand, who wrote the famous book Tortured for Christ, and was tortured for Christ in Romanian prisons by...
Oh, there's an objective source right there. Somebody who was arrested in Romania, tortured, and came to a Western country. That's an objective view of Marxism right there. You're going to get a totally objective view from someone who's been traumatized by torture. They're going to give you an objective view of Marxism.
Communist captors who were shouting, "I am the devil," while they were torturing him. He did a book called Marx and Satan. He's
totally objective, I'm sure, right? Not influenced by this man's personal experience and the horrors that he went through. You know, I'm sure it's just a purely objective source.
Convinced that Marx was a Satanist and did some things ritualistically that it might have even been satanic. But I can't say that. I can't endorse that.
But you see evidence of that in his play.
I've never seen,
in terms of at least his fantasies.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
In fact, Payne even goes so far as to say Vladimir Lenin, right? There's a statement from Lenin which said, when I was a teen, I broke from all religion. I took the cross from my neck and I threw it in the rubbish bin. And Payne has a quote where, not Payne, Richard Wurmbrand, where I think he believes that Lenin even stomped on it.
Wait a second. So you're saying there's a quote that says he took off his cross and threw it in the garbage, and somebody else says he thinks that Karl Marx or that Lenin stomped on it, and that
says, well, that's a satanic ritual. I don't know that it is.
That is a satanic. Like, you want to talk about like how ridiculously stupid this is? So Lenin, who was an atheist, decides he's an atheist. He takes his cross off and he says he threw it in the garbage. Somebody else who's very biased says he stomped on it. And somebody else says that is a ritual in some satanic something. Like, is there anything remotely political about this? I mean, this sounds like, Cloak and Dagger this sounds like he's trying to write a horror movie here or something. Like, this is the dumbest thing I have.
Or not. But there's another case of Lenin who at least did the work of the devil. I mean, Lenin had, according to Robert Conquest, W.H. Chamberlain, the first historian of the Russian Revolution, 500,000 people were killed from 1917 to 1923 under Lenin, not even including the Russian Civil War.
Yeah, well, I mean, the British Empire, again, did the work of the devil. I mean, how many people did they kill? I mean, it's just like, this is just so he's like making a religious case. I mean, this is very silly.
That's not the devil's work. I don't know what the hell it is, right?
I mean, and how many people were killed by anti-communist dictators around the world? I mean, 500,000 people were slaughtered in 1965 in Indonesia when the CIA overthrew the government and installed fanatical anti-communists, and they turned into a genocide against ethnically Chinese people. I mean, even now, the Nazis in Ukraine are burning down World War II memorials. There was the massacre in that trade union house. I mean, I'm waiting for like anything here that is of any substance.
But I think what Payne said in the latter quote, the devil's view of the world, the devil's malignity, and at the very least, this identification with kind of devilish like destruction, right? Tearing everything down, rebelling against the world, everything that exists deserves to perish.
Now we're getting to a legitimate point. Amid all of the silliness, we finally have gotten to a somewhat legitimate point. Okay, right? He's getting to something here, right?
That at least. And then the ideology that he created that just happened to be responsible for the deaths of over 100 million people in the 20th century.
No, where do those numbers come from, right? Those numbers come from famines. And it was the communists who cured the famines, because famines were going on in these countries all the time before the communists came on. Until the communists came along, they didn't have industrial they didn't have mechanized agriculture. They didn't have tractors in the Soviet Union until the communists came along. Till the communists came along, China didn't have electricity. It was the communists who cured the famines. And those big, huge numbers you hear are from famines, which happened all the time before the communists came in, and the communists cured them. So saying that, oh, well, these communists killed 100 gajillion good million people, those numbers come from famines, and those famines happened before the communists, and the communists cured them. That would be like saying that, the doctor who cures the cancer is responsible for the cancer. Those numbers don't mean jack shit. Okay. Those huge numbers, they come from something that the communists cured, right? And this is what they always do, right? There were famines all the time in China before the Chinese Communist Party came in. But yes, under their leadership in the early 60s, there was a horrendous famine. And after that, there weren't any, right? There were famines all the time before the communists came into the Soviet Union. In the early 1930s, there was a very bad famine in Ukraine. And then there wasn't any after that. I mean, it's the communists build a modern country. They build a modern food system. They bring tractors to the countryside. They bring electricity. And somehow something that happened under the old system all the time is their fault and is intentional murder. I mean, we've heard this all before.
More than World War I and World War II combined. So that ideology was pretty hellacious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to say the least.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not like millions and millions of people haven't been killed by free trade and capitalism. Millions of people didn't die in the transatlantic slave trade. Millions weren't killed in Vietnam. Millions weren't killed in Korea. Millions weren't killed in country after country after country where the U.S. imperialists have destroyed it. How many? I mean, this is just standard.
Okay, so, and I think it's very naive not to assume that the events that we described in Marx's life are not connected, right?
Yeah,
right.
Correct.
And that his economic polemics were somehow independent of his poetic imagination.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, obviously they weren't, because they wouldn't have had that motivational force.
Mm-hmm.
So they were calling on dark forces, obviously.
No, Marxism originated as a movement in the aftermath of the revolutions to overturn feudalism and bring capitalism into the world. And feudalism was a society where the church and the state were the same institution. And the French Revolution in particular was very anti-religious, because religion, the church, had been the mechanism through which the feudal aristocracy had ruled. And out of the French Revolution, which was very anti-religious, which destroyed all the churches, the cult of the supreme being, executed priests, etc., they saw that they did not create the egalitarian society they were hoping to build. The revolutions to overturn feudal relations, the 1848 revolutions throughout Europe, they did not result in the creation of a society that was truly egalitarian. They didn't see the liberté, égalité, fraternité. And that the French Revolution and the revolutions to overturn feudalism largely tapped into people's desire for rebellion, libidinal release, right? The unleashing people's anger and rage, the rage of the peasantry, unleashing people's sexual desires. That was very much what the French Revolution and the revolutionary intelligentsia and the revolutionary movements of Europe, of which Marxism started, was attached to. And that aesthetic is largely what the communist countries of the world have moved away from. Communist countries around the world promote traditional family values now. And that aesthetic is also largely what the Western left is promoting. The color revolutions that are happening all across Europe, and George Soros and the State Department, the people trying to overthrow Maduro in Venezuela, they all wear Guy Fawkes masks. They all, are pumped up about rebellion. It is the West that has hijacked the aesthetic, the dark forces that you're talking about. Yes, Marx absolutely was part of the revolutionary intelligentsia in Europe that had that anti-religious spirit of rebellion and passion. that was about destruction, that was about unleashing people's impulses. And the communist countries of the world have largely broken with that. And the Western capitalist countries are now using that aesthetic to destabilize the world.
So, because otherwise they wouldn't have compelled people in that manner, especially not toward that sort of immense sadistic murderousness and utter destructiveness.
Yeah, utter destruction. China becoming a superpower, right? The Soviet Union inventing space travel and raising all these people up out of poverty. Yeah, how could anyone go along with that, right? Why would people why would peasants that are semi-slaves want to have their own land? You know, I mean, it's like, this is just so, you have to know nothing, right? You have to have never heard the other side of the story to even entertain this. First, he's giving us a Hollywood horror movie about, you know, devils and Mephistopheles and horns and tails and a dark man. And next, you know, I mean, this is just so silly.
And of course, get to the hatred of God, which all the communists did. So all the
actually, no, they don't. You know, the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, is a Roman Catholic. The president of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, is also a Roman Catholic. You know, the head of the Communist Party of Russia, Gennady Zhuganov, is an Orthodox Christian. You know, I mean, this is this is just silliness.
Communists thereafter seek to ban religion.
Right. Atheists.
That's
like,
right.
They're not exactly atheists because they're trying to stomp something out.
That's right. It's not
It's not a neutrality.
That's right. It's not a neutrality toward religion. It's not irreligion. It's not separation of church and state. It is militant, aggressive atheism. Trotsky and Lenin create the League of the Militant Godless.
And Stalin brought back the Russian Orthodox Church. And Trotsky is the one that the Western liberals liked. And in fact, Trotskyite groups have been funded by the CIA all over the world to work against communist governments, right? In fact, many of the neoconservatives in the Bush administration were themselves former Trotskyists, right? I mean, so I'm not following this at all, right? In Russia today, Stalin is wildly loved. Stalin, who brought back the Russian Orthodox Church, and Trotskyists are the people running our country over here. So, I mean, I'm not following you.
Right.
They ban religion. They have the Moscow church trials. They blow up churches. They jail priests, right? You know, the Solzhenitsyn writes in the Gulag Archipelago, they put nuns in special sections of the Gulag with prostitutes.
Yes, right.
Deem them whores to Christ.
Absolutely.
Lenin said, all worship of a divinity is a necrophilia. There is nothing more abominable than religion.
Yeah.
So they don't just try to stop religion. They want Pol Pot, the Buddhist monks in Cambodia, to renounce their...
Pol Pot was funded by the CIA. That's a fact. Google, CIA funded Pol Pot. Pol Pot was funded by the United States to fight against Vietnam, which was aligned with the Soviet Union.
Vows to marry. It's not enough for them to be quiet. And so after 4 years... I don't
know how you can separate a militantly anti-religious atheism from especially, say, within a Christian context, from something approximating satanic ideology. Because
satanic ideology believes in free market capitalism.
Right.
I don't see how conceptually that separation is possible. It's one thing to be atheist in the manner that leaves people to go to hell in a handbasket in their own way, but to be actually an enemy of the religious enterprise, that's a whole different thing.
It is.
Well, if you lived in a feudal society where if you so much as uttered one word in criticism of the church, you'd be burned at the stake, right? If you starved and the church told you that, oh, well, you have to give your food away to the landlord because he has the divine right to rule over you. You know, if you, I mean, I can think of situations in a feudal society in which one would develop a burning hatred for the church as an institution, because you have to admit that the church-led society of medieval Europe was a very oppressive one, in which the church was giving credence to the brutal oppression of some by others, right? You know, obviously, I don't think that was an accurate representation of Christianity and what it was about. I think that the church was an idol, and that idol needed to be torn down. But I mean, I can think of people who are oppressed, people that are enslaved, and told that, oh, well, you deserve to be a slave because the church says so. I can imagine them being very hatred. Why can't he ever imagine this situation? I'm curious why Jordan Peterson is so historically illiterate. He can't imagine why people that are enslaved in the name of religion might hate religion, why people who are oppressed by landowners in the name of religion might hate religion, why people who are living under a tyrannical king who they're told has divine right to rule over them by God might come to hate religion. If you look at what feudal society was and what feudalism is, you can understand why people that are rebelling against feudalism might also develop a strong hatred for the institution that justifies feudalism, which was the church, right? And I don't feel that feudal church, the feudal system, is an accurate representation of what Jesus wanted, or is an accurate representation of God on earth. But if religion was presented as the church holding up the king's divine right to rule over the people, and the church was presented as upholding the right of slave owners to own slaves and the right of landowners to oppress peasants, I can understand why somebody might get mad about it. Why is this great psychologist, Jordan Peterson, incapable of understanding that? If religion is equated with oppressive human institutions that rule in the name of God, you can understand why people might develop a resentment and hostility toward religion. It's not that hard to understand, Jordan. You're like, oh, why would this ever happen? I think I can understand why that might happen, right? I mean, if the only communists I'd ever met were people that were oppressing me, I might hate communism. Would that make sense? Of course. So, I mean, I don't understand why he's saying, oh, I don't understand. I can understand it, right? If you had grown up in a feudal society in which you had been told that you're an inferior person, that you're a second-class citizen, that you have natural superiors who rule over you, and this was all sanctified in the name of religion, you'd be mad about that. In England, Oliver Cromwell cut off the head of Charles I, the King of England, for saying that. He called it a heresy, right? In England, the Puritans revolted, and they had the English Civil War. In France, it was atheistic, but you can understand that. You can understand why people would resent religion under such circumstances. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know why he's playing dumb here. This whole thing is just.
So, and that obviously Marx and the communists were obviously that, clearly, obviously.
And Satan might say, I don't care if you believe in me or not. You're doing my work, man. I mean, you're shutting down churches, blowing up churches.
That also touches on the issue of what it means to believe, right? And I mean,
blowing up churches like the Wahhabis that were funded by the U.S. government in Syria to murder Christians, blowing up churches like the U.S. NATO bombs did in Serbia when they bombed and destroyed Serbia, blowing up church. I mean, there's been plenty examples of persecution of Christians at the hands of the United States and its allies around the world. Plenty of examples of that. And right now, all over Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is being brutally oppressed, by the U.S.-backed regime. Priests are getting arrested. Church property is being seized. They're accusing the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of being a front for Russia, and they're persecuting priests. So again, what ideology is this being done in the name of? Western liberal democracy.
You could imagine someone comparatively harmless who toys with ritualistic satanic activities in a sort of dramatic manner. Mm-hmm. And then you could imagine someone who tortures nuns and priests and burns down churches, but forgoes any technical affiliation with Satan.
Right.
I would say that the latter is the Satanist in a much deeper sense than the former.
That's
Not
right.
that what the former is doing is excusable.
Yeah, or at least satanic.
Yes, right. But to do what the communists did to the religious enterprise is evidence of something far more militant than a mere atheism.
Yeah, they live in a bubble, and there is absolutely nothing in this that, if you are not already a religious anti-communist, is going to persuade you, right? And it is just pandering to people's ignorance, telling people a fairy tale story of Karl Marx, the dark man who hopped around and had horns on his head. I mean, I'm embarrassed. I'm honestly embarrassed for this man, right? I mean, you know, I'm honestly embarrassed. Now, he was trying, the grain of truth in what he was saying is what we've talked about. We are city builders. We talk about city builders and vandals, and how the vandal tendency, right, has emerged within the Marxist current, right? And that Trotskyism and nowadays the synthetic left takes the very evil, destructive side, the rebellious aspects of Marxism, and codifies them into a vehicle for destabilizing countries around the world. And the Marxism that they teach on college campuses, that is more about Judith Butler and Susan Sontag, that stuff is very destructive, and it is focused on tearing things down. It is focused on libidinal release, and it is totally opposed to all the socialist governments, right? Trotsky was for permanent revolution. Stalin was for socialism in one country, right? And the Marxism that is the vulgar, rebellious, anti-religious, destructive, tear it down, burn it down Marxism is the Marxism that is funded by the American government. And the Marxism that they practice in China and Cuba and Venezuela and North Korea, etc., is the Marxism that the US government is trying to destroy. And it is all about building and constructing. And it's also coming to terms with and making peace with religion, largely, especially in Latin America and many other places. So this whole thing is just, I'm embarrassed for that whole segment. It was painful. It was very, very painful. The city building tendency versus the vandal tendency. Exactly. I mean, and it's like, I mean, the attempt to equate wokeism with what goes on in China. You think they're woke in China? I mean, you think that, I mean, it's like, how can they say this? This is such intellectual dishonesty, right? You think that's what they're doing in China? They're firing professors because they don't say transgender loud enough. I mean, you think that's what they're doing in China? You think, you read Mao's writings. He's talking about how, white privilege, white people have it too good, and we need to punish them for being, I mean, that's not, it's just infuriating. It's really, really infuriating to see this stupid discourse around communism, where we have the woke left who think, a lot of them think that they're communists, and they don't know anything about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. They don't know anything about overproduction, the tendency of the falling rate of profit. They don't know anything about Marxism, right? And they're talking around as if they're Marxists. They hate all the actual Marxist governments on the one hand, and then we got the right wing that agrees with them. Oh yeah, they are Marxists. And it's like, there's no one talking about how we can organize the economy to raise living standards for the people, to get out of the disaster that we are in as a country right now. No one's talking about how we can organize the economy to make a better life for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Hey folks. So the right-wing YouTube channel, PragerU, made a video supposedly addressing the question, who was Karl Marx? Now, there's so many things in this video that are just wildly inaccurate and incorrect, I don't really know where to begin. But I'm going to go over just a few of the wildly inaccurate statements in this video.
And controls pretty much everything. This notion was widely discussed and debated in European intellectual circles during Marx's lifetime. But nothing much came of it until Vladimir Lenin took power in Russia in 1917.
Not much happened in relation to Marxism after Karl Marx's death until the Russian Revolution, they say. They say it was discussed in intellectual circles. Really? Really? How about the fact that progressive laws were passed all across Europe as Marxist-led movements and political parties demanded things like, 8-hour workdays and progressive legislation? How about the fact that in the United States, Marxists were key in the struggle to overturn slavery? I mean, Marxism, between Marx's death and the Russian Revolution, did all kinds of things. It was one of the biggest mass movements that had ever been seen, especially in Western Europe. Huge social democratic parties and labor parties were formed. Unions were formed in factories. Later in the video, he goes on to point out that in the aftermath of Marx's life, the standard of living went up across Europe. And he seems to ignore that that was because there was a huge Marxist movement building labor unions, building progressive organizations, demanding people's rights, fighting against the bosses, and winning these things. He makes it sound like nobody believed in Marxism. No one thought about Marxism except they were talking about it in intellectual circles. Until the Russian Revolution. That is ridiculous. Until the Russian Revolution, the Marxist movement was biggest in Germany, actually. The German Social Democratic Party, led by Karl Kautsky. There were figures like Edward Bernstein. All across Europe, there was a vast Marxist movement that was key in fighting for the right to vote, fighting for the rights of workers on the job, fighting for the rights of women. How in the world can he say that it was just kind of discussed in intellectual circles until 1917? That is just completely outrageous that he would even say that. He should be embarrassed. This man calls himself a professor of political science. Does he not know where one of the main political parties in Germany, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, originated? Has he never heard of the British Labour Party? Does he know where they came from? But nobody did anything about Marxism. Nobody. Not the Fabian Society, not the Chartist movement, not the labor movement. None of that. Nothing happened. Nothing. They were just talking about it in intellectual circles until 1917. How does anyone take him seriously? Marxism was one of the biggest political movements Europe has ever seen, and it was very, very, very widespread and popular long before the Russian Revolution.
Wherever Marx's ideas were practiced, life got worse. Not by a little, but by a lot. There is not a single exception to this rule. Not the Soviet Union, not Eastern Europe, not China, not North Korea, not Vietnam, not Cuba, not Venezuela, not Bolivia, not Zimbabwe. Wherever Marxism goes, economic collapse, terror, and famine follow.
At the time of the Russian Revolution, Russia was a very, very impoverished country. It had an agrarian economy. Most of the country didn't have running water. Most of the country was illiterate, about 65% illiteracy. Most of the country did not have electricity. By 1936, the Soviet Union had become a world industrial power. They had electrified the entire country. They had provided every person with running water. They had wiped out illiteracy. They had universal employment. Villages that had been huts, where people were living in like primitive conditions, were replaced with modern housing units where everyone had running water and electricity. In 1936, just shortly after the Russian Revolution, just 2 decades after the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union was producing more steel than any other country in the entire world. In 1936, the Soviet Union had the world's largest hydroelectrical power plant, the Dnieper Dam. The life expectancy vastly improved. The population for the first time had access to education, they had running water, they had electricity, they had access to medical care, but he says that it made life worse. You can criticize the Soviet Union all you want, there were problems there. We're not talking human rights here, we're just talking by objective measure. He says that it made life worse in the Soviet Union and everywhere else. Made life worse. Compare Russia in 1936, after it had fully industrialized with socialism and the 5-year plans of Stalin. Compare it to 1917. By no objective measure is that in any way the case. Living conditions had vastly improved. The standard of living had vastly risen. I mean, and this wasn't just something that communists were saying. Look at the Time magazine articles. Read the New York Times from that period. Read how even like right-wingers were going over there and marveling about it. The whole world was actually blown away by what the Soviet Union was achieving during the 1930s. So for him to say that it made life worse just shows that he's completely out of touch with reality. And he talks about China. He says, oh, and it just made life worse in China too. Really? Really? Let's talk about China. In 1949, there was not a single steel mill in China. Today, half the steel in the entire world is produced in the state-run steel industry in China. The Chinese Communist Party has lifted 700 million people out of poverty. Today, the world tourism industry is having a boom because people whose ancestors, parents and grandparents were peasants who were illiterate and malnourished, are now going on vacation to New York City and Paris and London. The achievements of both the Russian Revolution in terms of making the Soviet Union into a world industrial superpower, the achievements of the Chinese Revolution are vast. How does this man say this with a straight face? I don't understand how someone can say such wildly inaccurate things. Any economic textbook can show you what was achieved in both the Soviet Union and China. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia and China were deeply poor countries. Today, Russia and China are global superpowers. China has the second largest economy in the world. I don't know how anyone can say this. I mean, this is just outrageous that he can even get away with this. You know, he talks about Cuba. Well, compare the way Cubans live to the way people live in Haiti or the Dominican Republic or other developing countries around the world. You can criticize these countries all you want, but to say that it made life worse, that's just wildly inaccurate. Nobody would say that Cubans' living conditions were better under Batista before 1959 than they are today. Nobody would say that. Nobody would say that. In no objective measure did the conditions get worse. In fact, the Cuban healthcare system is studied all over the world for its achievements. You know, I mean, unbelievable that he can get away with this. But let's get to another part of the video.
So, if cataclysmic failure, meaning terrible human suffering, is the inevitable legacy of Marxism, why do so many people, and now especially young people, defend it? The most common answer Marxism's advocates offer is that they, whoever they are, Lenin, Stalin, Chavez, never really practiced Marxism. They all somehow got it wrong.
Now, this is interesting because he's correct. Now, most people in the USA and in Western Europe who call themselves Marxists will do that. They'll just say, oh, it wasn't real socialism. And you know why that is? Because they're cowards. And because Marxism, the Marxist movement, at this point is largely tied to academia. If you are a Marxist, one of the places for you to get employment is at universities. And if you want to be a Marxist at a university, you can get a grant to write a book about white privilege. You can get a grant to write a book about transgender oppression. But if you write a book challenging the narrative regarding the history of the 20th century and the socialist countries, you're not going to get a grant to publish it, and they're not going to have anything to do with it. Why? Because the universities largely depend on grants and foundations provided by the Rockefellers and the Ford Foundation and lots of very, very well-funded capitalist institutions that do not want to hear this. They have no problem with the cultural side of Marxism. They think gay rights is great. They think that, you know, that women's liberation is great. They have no problem with, you know, the kind of cultural critique. But when you start defending alternatives to capitalism, they have a big problem with it. But I wanted to go on to another thing that he said in this video. This is another thing he says about Karl Marx.
Marx spent his days in the reading room of the British Museum, researching and writing. Although he was obsessed with the term scientific, he was never able to marshal data to prove his theories. There's a good reason for this. There was no data to prove his theories. For all his time in the library, Marx couldn't find any evidence to suggest that capitalism, the free exchange of goods and services through privately owned business, was a passing phase.
No data. Has this man ever opened the book Capital? Has he ever opened it? I mean, the book is full of statistics from the British Museum, statistics about the production of cotton, the production of steel, the production, all kinds of economic statistics throughout the book. It's a dense text. I mean, has this man ever even opened it? To say that Marx never relied on any data, I mean, what a lunatic. I mean, how does this man get away with saying these kind of things? I don't know how he gets away with this. No data. Really, open the book Capital. It's available. You can get it at most bookstores, most libraries. Open the book Capital and see if it has no data in it. I challenge you. The book is full of statistics.
Since few people give up their liberties and property voluntarily, creating a Marxist state has always required guns, prisons, and summary executions. Marx's many disciples from Lenin on never considered this a problem.
Here we go again. Now, he insists that Marxists believe in violent revolution. Well, actually, if you'll look at how these Marxist revolutions have happened, it wasn't the Marxists who favored a violent revolution. For example, he talks about China, the Chinese Revolution. The communists wanted, at the end of the Second World War, to have a coalition government with the nationalists and the KMT and Chiang Kai-shek. They favored a coalition government. And the KMT, the Nationalist Party of China, which was aligned with the United States, would not allow the communists to participate in the elections. He says that communists don't believe that they can ever take power peacefully. In Chile, in 1973, Salvador Allende took power peacefully. He was elected. And the response was the CIA removing him. The United States backed Augusto Pinochet to be very, very violent. And the Venezuelan government, the Bolivarian government of Venezuela, came to power peacefully. Chavez was elected in 1999, and he peacefully took power, and in 2003 began moving the country towards socialism. In Bolivia, Evo Morales, the Marxist president, was elected peacefully. You know, actually reading the writings of Lenin, the writings of Stalin, the writings of, you know, other leaders, you can see a strong critique of what they call left adventurism or punchism.
Communists always favor peaceful means of taking power. However, the capitalists, in order to preserve their wealth, tend to be very, very violent and get rid of any democratic institution in order to preserve their power. So this notion that communists favor violence or violent revolution is simply false. If you look at it, in so many instances, you can see communists are the ones that are trying to peacefully transform the society, and then the capitalists are violent to them and they defend themselves. That's almost how every single revolution in the history of Marxism has gone down. Grove City College should be embarrassed to have this man as a professor. This man thinks nothing happened in relation to Marxism except intellectual circles discussed it between Marx's death in 1917. This man does not understand that vast living standard achievements took place in the Soviet Union, China, and other countries. This man does not understand that the Marxist movement has vastly debated and discussed the issue of rejecting left adventurism and punchism and favoring a peaceful transition to socialism. This man doesn't know any of that, and he calls himself a professor of political science. This man is teaching young people about Marxism when he has absolutely no understanding of Marxism himself. This man thinks that the book Capital does not have any statistics in it. Grove City College should be embarrassed to have this man on the faculty.